The clock above the entrance ticked loudly, the sound echoing through the nearly empty store. Melissa glanced up, noting the time, 9:55 p.m. Just 5 more minutes, and she could lock up for the night. The mall was already quiet, most of the other stores darkened and deserted, the faint hum of the overhead lights creating a strange, isolated atmosphere. She worked at a small retail shop specializing in vintage clothing and odd trinkets, a place that had always felt a bit off to her, especially at night. The store's music, a constant loop of old jazz tunes mixed with obscure tracks from the 1920s and 30s, played softly in the background. During the day, it was charming, even comforting, but as the night crept in, the crackling, distorted melodies took on a more sinister tone. The music was piped in from an ancient sound system, complete with a record player in the back room that had been there long before Melissa started working at the shop. She walked through the aisles, straightening the last of the displays. The mannequins, draped in vintage dresses and suits, cast long, eerie shadows under the dim lights. She could feel the eyes of the mannequins on her, their blank stares unsettling as she moved among them. It was irrational, she knew, but the sensation was inescapable. The music didn't help either. It was louder now, the crackling of the record more pronounced, as if the music itself was growing agitated. As she reached the far end of the store, the song changed. It was an old tune she didn't recognize, something mournful and slow, with a low, droning melody that set her teeth on edge. There was something off about the sound, a slight warping, as though the record was being played at the wrong speed. The voice of the singer was distorted, stretched out unnaturally, making the lyrics indecipherable but deeply unsettling. Melissa shivered, trying to shake off the creeping sense of unease. She told herself it was just a record, an old, faulty piece of equipment that needed to be replaced. But as she turned back towards the front of the store, she thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The mannequins stood still, but the shadows around them seemed to twist and writhe, moving in time with the distorted music. The lights flickered, and Melissa's breath caught in her throat. The music stuttered, the record skipping briefly before resuming, the voice on the record now a low, guttural murmur. She felt a cold sweat break out across her skin as she hurried back to the register. The store felt wrong, the air thick and oppressive, as if something unseen was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. As she reached the counter, the lights flickered again, plunging the store into brief darkness before sputtering back to life. The music was louder now, impossibly loud, the record crackling and hissing like a living thing. The voice on the record seemed to be speaking directly to her, though the words were still warped and unintelligible. The lights continued to flicker, and in the brief moments of darkness, she could have sworn she saw shapes moving among the mannequins, twisted, unnatural figures that slithered between the racks of clothing. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking as she tried to lock the register. The music grew more distorted, the record player emitting a high-pitched whine that set her nerves on edge. It was as if the music was alive, pulsing through the air, warping reality around her. She glanced towards the back of the store, where the record player sat in its little alcove. The door to the back room was slightly ajar, a thin line of darkness visible beyond. She couldn't leave without turning off the record player. That was part of her closing duties, but the thought of going back there, of entering that shadowed room where the music seemed to originate, filled her with dread. But the alternative, leaving it on, letting it continue its twisted song, was somehow worse. Summoning all her courage, Melissa made her way to the back of the store. The music was almost deafening now, the distorted voice chanting in a language she couldn't understand. The shadows around her seemed to reach out, the air thickening with each step she took. When she reached the back room, she hesitated, staring at the door. It felt like a portal to another world, one where the normal rules of reality no longer applied. She pushed the door open, and the music cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was oppressive, more terrifying than the music had been. The record player sat in the center of the room, the needle resting on the record, but there was no movement, no sound. The record was still spinning, but the needle hovered just above the surface, not quite touching, as if something was holding it back. Melissa took a step forward, and the record player sprang to life. The needle dropped, the record spinning faster and faster, the music warping into a nightmarish cacophony of sound. The voice was no longer singing, it was screaming, a horrible, distorted wail that filled the room, making the walls tremble. The lights in the room flickered wildly, casting strange, flickering shadows that danced around her. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the music stopped. The record player fell silent, the room plunging into darkness. Melissa stood frozen, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She could feel something in the room with her, something that had been awakened by the music, something that was now watching her with malevolent intent. The lights flickered back on, but the record player was gone. In its place stood a figure, tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and as it stepped towards her, the shadows around it seemed to twist and writhe, reaching out to her. Melissa turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest, the sound of the record player's distorted music echoing in her ears. She could hear footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, as the thing that had once been a record player followed her through the store. The mannequins seemed to move as she passed them, their blank eyes following her, their hands reaching out. She reached the front of the store, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the keys. The door seemed impossibly far away, the exit just out of reach. The music grew louder, the distorted voice chanting, screaming, calling to her. She could feel the presence behind her, feel its cold breath on the back of her neck. The key finally turned in the lock, and Melissa burst out of the store, slamming the door behind her. The music cut off abruptly, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as she stumbled into the empty mall. The silence was deafening, the only sound the echo of her own footsteps as she ran towards the exit, not daring to look back. The next morning, the store was found locked from the inside, the record player spinning an old, worn-out record that no one could identify. The music played on a continuous loop, a haunting, distorted melody that seemed to seep into the very walls of the store. The mannequins stood silently in their places, but their positions were different, their heads turned slightly, their hands raised as if reaching for something, or someone. Melissa was never seen again.